And
You're
I
welcome.
want to thank everyone for joining today for my presentation on the lead testing guidance for providers, as you know, concerning EPSDT.
Yolanda, you are muted.
Sorry, sorry about that. Did you guys hear what I just said? I'll just say it again. So I just want to thank everyone for joining today for my presentation of lead testing guidance for providers. Thank you again, Shannon, for that introduction. And I'll just go ahead and go into our overview. Next. So just a little quick history on lead. So lead is it's a metal. It's a soft grayish, maybe grayish blue metals. It's has a high density, low melting point, and it's very pliable metal, which makes it ideal for the use of in various industries, such as commercial and residential paints, plumbing, bathtub coatings, eating utensils, pottery, gasoline, and more things. So in 1976, the US government banned the use of lead as an additive to gasoline. And 2 years later, they also did the same for residential paint. But believe it or not, lead is still widely used in different manufacturing industries across the world. So yeah, we don't have it in our gas in our household paints anymore, but it's still in wide use commercially. And so homes built before 1978 are at an increased risk for having lead-based paint in them, therefore possibly having lead-based paint hazards. And so what makes paint hazardous is its state of condition. So if it's deteriorating, it's likely causing lead dust particles, and it's the dust particles that are what cause the most issues. You can breathe the dust particles in, and with young children and their hand to mouth activity, they ingest it from the fingers in their mouths, thumb sucking, and things of that sort. But you also can ingest it in food, or in very, very rare occasions, children may eat paint chips, but that's not something that's widely known to happen. Next, please. So young children under the age of 6. So this time of our lives as humans, that's where we are experience the most rapid development of growth in our lifetime. Is before the age of 6, which makes it critical for lead detection because any damage that occurs during that time period, that's the those are the fun, it's causing or slowing down the development, or it's damage that can't be undone to a child that's already developed. So some of the things that can happen to a child, the leg can one of the most widely, I guess, noted uh, body systems that impacts is the central nervous system, the brain, but it actually affects all of the body systems. Lead is highly toxic. Some of the outward signs and symptoms are learning difficulties, um, behavior issues, speech, issues with fine and gross motor skills like picking up pencils or small objects, and difficulty, with musculoskeletal, coordination, like walking and climbing and things of that sort, which children should be able to do at certain developmental milestones. And with lead poisoning, they won't be able to do it as readily. It causes delays and things of that sort. And the thing about lead is that it cannot differentiate from other beneficial metals that we need for our bodies, that's essential to life, such as iron and calcium. The body can't tell the difference between lead or those other metals. So, and that I point that out because children that are malnourished, in particular, they will more readily take up lead as opposed to a child that's not as, they don't have, they are well nourished. So if they don't have an iron deficiency, calcium, vitamin C, these things help the body to grow and develop. But if they don't, the lead will implant itself and it makes it harder to get it out of the body. So it's important, to ensure that the child has, good nutrition and stuff. Not saying that they won't get lead poisoning, they still will, but the nutrition kind of help it to not absorb as readily. And lead does not show any outward signs and symptoms, and that makes it difficult to detect. And in particular for young children, like some of the behavior that I noted earlier, like behavior, and like a lot of children, they don't have very long attention spans. That's typical of it, maybe a 1 or 2 year old. So you may not make notice, or at least it's normal behavior to us for a young child. So it's very important to ensure that children at those young ages, at 1 and 2, young before the age of 6, if they haven't had one, to get tested, because there are no way to detect lead poisoning or lead exposure unless you do lead testing. And it's the two routes of taking a example for lead would be either from the vein or a venous draw, or capillary, which is a finger prick from a machine that, some doctors' offices may have a lead care analyzer 2 machine, and prick it, and machine analyzes it within like 3 minutes and can give you a test result right then and there. But the venous draw is more, it's a more accurate test. It's the gold standard for lead testing, because capillary testing, even though it's quick, it's easy, and it's very useful for doctors that may have families that are maybe hard to get them in. They may have issues with transportation. You have a captive, a captive audience there. You can get it out of the way, so it makes it convenient. But sometimes it can be false readings on it, so that's something to take into consideration. And again, like I said, once lead poisoning, if there's damage from it, if you catch it early enough, we want to try to catch lead exposure, lead poisoning as early as possible before it can cause any lasting damage. When any damage done by lead poisoning is permanent, it's irreversible, which is devastating to a young child that's developing, because it just totally puts them behind. And that's there's no hope, for the development to ever kind of be on track from that point forward. Next slide, please. And other factors to consider: pregnant women. Women who are working in maybe high risk industries, or recommended to maybe take time off, while they're pregnant. Other issues with moms, expectant mothers, that we call it like the nesting instinct, where moms want to kind of make the home cozy. So if mom is living in an older home and she's trying to do some it's like some home improvement to kind of make the home cozy for baby, that can cause lead exposure, depending on what it is. If she's kind of doing some scraping of the wall, and I actually had a case where that has actually happened when I was in my years with Delaware Public Health, where a mom did that, and the child was exposed in vitro to lead poisoning and had some extensive damage to the central nervous system, had nervous tics and all that kind of stuff. So it's important, even though uh, this this is probably more like pediatrics are here on the line, but if we had any other audiences as far as the OBGYNs, it's important for them to make sure that moms, if they live in older homes, maybe test them for lead poisoning as well, or if they have spouses, or if they work in high risk industries. So some of those high risk industries to know, and hobbies, are artists. So artists that use oil paints, artists that like to do stained glass making, those beautiful stained glass art and stuff. You find it in some older homes, that have like the glass door pane above, and like up on their doors, or you find them in churches. Also battery manufacturers, construction workers, and particularly the construction workers that work on older homes or buildings, glass manufacturers, welders, and lead manufacturers. Again, like I said before, lead is still widely used, so we still have lead manufacturers. They mine and they smelter lead, which makes it a hazard, because of the lead, the particles that are emitted while creating or manufacturing whatever product they're working with. And some families, to jump off out of that to personal use and things that families do. Some families use imported products such as cosmetic, foods, folk and herbal remedies, toys. And I wanted to say, like sometimes, believe it or not, some products may not even be imported. I know for cosmetics, for instance, this maybe about 15 years or so ago, I think it might have been Maybelline or one of those um, uh, cosmetic companies had found lead in the lipstick, of all things, lipsticks right on your lips. So imagine if a pregnant mom is wearing that on her lips, or if a child, use that for Halloween, today's Halloween. So, people use makeup for these things. So stuff to note. So even some of our domestic products may even have lead. And I've seen some recalls. There is a recall list for the U.S. Consumer Protection Services Agency. They have a list of recall, like items for recall and stuff like that. You may find stuff there, as well as the CDC. But also foods from like like imported foods. And I would say, like, families that are like newly immigrated to the US may still use food products from their native lands. So foods can have they could be wrapped in material that has lead paint on it, or it could have ingredients that have been grown in an environment that have lead in the soil. So, and that's the same thing for the remedies and herbal and folk remedies, older toys, and stuff. So it's important that children are tested for lead at 1 and 2. And I think some states, not sure if Louisiana have, and we probably can discuss that more after my presentation, but I know that there's quite a few states across the US that have universal testing, meaning that they require that all children at 1 and 2, regardless of what your insurance status is, that they're tested for lead, which I think is a good thing, because it's important to catch these things. And sometimes it's not always where you live, but what you're using as well, to ensure that the children are safe and they're not using something that could harm them down the line. Next slide. So just some of the requirements, and just to start off with some of the disparate populations that we come across with lead. So the first population is overall children under the age of 6. And the reason why that is because, and the younger, the more highly at risk, because there's more hand-to-mouth activity. That's the stage that, a lot of younger children, and sometimes children that are developmentally delayed, or they have an increased hand-to-mouth behavior, and that puts them at risk for those lead exposure through the dust particles in a house that may have deteriorating lead-based paint. And so children who are in older homes that are built before 1978, they are children at Medicaid and CHIP, because they are below the federal poverty line. They tend to live in those older homes. They're usually I guess cheaper to live in some of those homes, depending on where. So and if they're not kept up, you have more issues with seeing lead exposure in those populations, as well as the Black, African American, Hispanic, and other minorities are also at an increased risk. Children who are newly immigrated, refugees, or children that are recently adopted, especially from developing nations, children, as I mentioned before, those adults who are employed in high-risk vocations, or adults that are in the household who are have hobbies that are high-risk hobbies that I mentioned earlier, are also at a increased risk, especially if they're doing those hobbies within the home, and adults that are in those high-risk vocations should be, by their employers, hopefully, uh, like, told not to take their contaminants home. They should be able to do that stuff at work, but we find that this is not always the case. Sometimes they can even have it in their cars, and that contaminant, if the child gets into the car, they could get exposure from that dust particles and, materials there. So it can happen in the car, it can happen in the home, in these situations where the adults are transporting the hazards, from where they do their work or hobbies back into the home or any environment where the child lives. So, therefore, as what I explained earlier, the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, requires that all children enrolled in Medicaid and CHIP are required for lead testing, regardless of the age of the home, any kind of screening questionnaires, they must be tested. And again, like I said, it doesn't matter because, sometimes families unknowingly have habits that will expose them through some of the products that they're using. So it's important to test, all children at 1 and 2 that are enrolled in Medicaid or CHIP. And if they've missed their lead testing schedules at 1 and 2, then they need a catch-up test between 24 and 72 months. So for instance, if a child is 2.5 years old, 3 years old, and the doctor notes that, oh, the child hasn't been tested for lead, then they only need one catch-up test to, for screening. Now, of course, it would be more if it was any kind of elevation, and it would require a different protocol, but that's how that's the requirement for testing of young children. Next slide, please. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we call them CDC, they established a new reference value. I think this came out maybe like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so the new reference value, down from 5, is now at 3.5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. So that's significantly lower than 5. It used to be at 10 years, like many years ago. But and they 12, 13 years ago, they put it down to 5, and now it's down to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. And so the CDC also recommends that children who have lead levels between 3.5 to 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood be provided case management to mitigate health effects and remove environmental lead hazards. But this is just a recommendation. Many states may not be able to incorporate those recommendations at that lower level because of funding limitations and stuff. So unfortunately, it's probably not happening at that recommended level. It would be great. But I'm sure that the numbers, more children probably have a lower level than they do higher. So it's probably harder to deal with it at that level, lower level. But hopefully we'll see more funding pour into that area of intervention. And so, as I mentioned earlier, even though they've established the reference value and the ranges for case management, again, just remember that there are no safe levels of lead. Lead is completely toxic. It's no beneficial to the human biologically whatsoever. So like iron and calcium and trace amounts are beneficial to us for oxygen, carrying oxygen throughout our body, such as iron, and building up strong bones, teeth, and stuff. For calcium, lead has no benefits whatsoever. So I'm sure it may be even lower of a range, but they haven't investigated lower than those levels thus far. And long-term exposure to low levels of blood can do harm to a developing child. So early detection is highly recommended, because even though a child may not have an astronomical level of lead in their bloodstream, low levels have been noted to still cause damage, and it could be more damaging actually because the lower levels they've studied this on the CDC, and if it's like ignored longer. So then, like with a child that has a level, say like at 40 micrograms per deciliters above, they may chelate them and everything, because the effects, if high enough, lead can be deadly, but low levels can still cause damage if not treated properly. Next slide, please. All right, so for billing, so these are the billing codes that are important for us to see in order for us to capture capture the data we need for us to tell how many children heard lead poisoning and how well we're doing with testing our members. So the billing code, the claims code, CPT code is 83655 for lead. And then the encounter codes is telling you exactly what that testing was done for. So for a routine lead test is the Z00 period 121 or Z00.129. The one for lead exposure is Z77.011. And the one that's for someone that's being examined or seen for exposure to a contaminant, which is a broad statement, but lead is a contaminant. That one would be a Z13.88. And that's with or without secondary codes. So the other codes that are below are what we call diagnosis codes. So, and I didn't break those down here, but these are the T codes. So depending on the diagnosis, these codes would be used in addition to the CPT code that's listed at the top. The first one I mentioned for the lead testing. And that is it for the billing codes. And I think that's all. Can you go to the next slide, Shannon? That is all for my presentation. Are there any questions today for me?